It was the kind of night that should never have happened, the kind of collision between two worlds so fundamentally different that no promoter in their right mind would have put them on the same bill, let alone the same stage. On one side stood Johnny Cash, the man in black, a walking hymn book wrapped in darkness, a man who had crawled through the fires of amphetamine addiction and emerged clutching the hand of God with the same fingers that once trembled around pill bottles in the back of a tour bus. On the other side stood Lemmy Kilmister, the man who made the devil look like a Sunday school teacher, a walking monument to every vice the Bible ever warned against, a man who had consumed enough Jack Daniels to fill an Olympic swimming pool and enough speed to keep an entire army awake for a decade. These two men had no business being friends, no business sharing a drink, let alone a stage. And yet, what happened between them on that night would become one of the most legendary untold moments in the history of rock and roll. Because when Johnny Cash reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a leather-bound Bible, and handed it directly to Lemmy Kilmister in front of thousands of screaming fans, nobody could have predicted what Lemmy would do next. And nobody could have predicted that Johnny Cash, the most devout man in country music, would laugh so hard that he had to grab the microphone stand just to keep himself from falling over. But before that moment arrived, before the Bible changed hands, and before the laughter echoed through the rafters, there was a story that stretched back years, a friendship forged in the most unlikely of places, built on mutual respect between a man who feared God and a man who feared absolutely nothing. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss any of our stories about the legends of rock and roll. The unlikely bond. The friendship between Johnny Cash and Lemmy Kilmister did not begin with a handshake or a formal introduction at some industry event. It began through sound, through the unmistakable recognition that someone else out there understood what it meant to live on the edge and turn that pain into something the whole world could feel. Cash had been walking that line since the 1950s, building a career on the raw honesty of a voice that sounded like gravel soaked in whiskey and regret. He had been to the bottom, swallowing handfuls of amphetamines during the 60s, until his body weighed barely 150 pounds, and his first wife Vivian barely recognized the skeleton that stumbled through the front door at 3 in the morning. He had nearly burned down an entire national forest in California when a truck he was driving caught fire, and he was too wasted to care. And then June Carter had pulled him back from the grave, and God had done the rest, or at least that was how Cash told the story for the remaining decades of his life. By the 90s, Johnny Cash had become something more than a country singer. He had become a symbol of redemption itself, the living proof that a man could walk through hell and come out the other side still standing, still singing, still believing in something bigger than himself. Lemmy, on the other hand, had walked through that same hell and decided to set up permanent residence there. Born on Christmas Eve 1945 in Stoke-on-Trent, England, he had never known his father and had grown up with the kind of restless anger that either lands a man in prison or on a stage. By the late 60s, he was working as a roadie for Jimi Hendrix, carrying amplifiers and running errands that sometimes included procuring substances that polite society preferred not to name. He watched Hendrix command audiences with nothing but raw talent and fearless energy, and he decided that if he ever got his own shot, he would push things even louder, faster, more dangerous than anything the world had ever heard. When he formed Motorhead in 1975, after being fired from Hawkwind at a Canadian border crossing because customs officers found amphetamines in his pocket, Lemmy delivered on that promise with a vengeance. Motorhead became the loudest band on earth, and Lemmy became the high priest of a lifestyle that most doctors said should have killed him before he turned 40. For 50 years, he drank almost nothing but Jack Daniels and Coke, smoked Marlboros the way other people breathed oxygen, and consumed enough amphetamines to stock a pharmacy. His doctors famously warned against ever trying to clean his blood, because his body had adapted so completely to the chemicals flowing through it that removing them might actually send him into fatal shock. Whether that story is medically precise, or one of those legends that grew larger with every retelling, it captured something essential about the man, the sense that he had transcended normal human biology and was operating on a system entirely his own. But there was something about Lemmy that went beyond the Jack Daniels and the speed and the Rickenbacker bass. There was an honesty in him, a complete rejection of hypocrisy that made him one of the most respected figures in music history. And it was precisely that honesty that drew Johnny Cash to him like a moth to a very loud, very dangerous flame. When the man in black met the man in bullets, the first time Cash and Lemmy actually spent real time together was backstage at a festival in the mid-90s, during the period when producer Rick Rubin had essentially resurrected Cash's career with the American recording series. Rubin understood something Nashville had forgotten. Johnny Cash was not a country singer. He was a force of nature who happened to sing country songs, and that force had more in common with the raw energy of punk and metal than with the polished Nashville machine that had discarded him. The American recording stripped everything away, leaving nothing but Cash's voice, his guitar, and the weight of a life lived at full volume. Suddenly Cash was relevant again to rock fans, metal fans, people who had never listened to a country song but recognized authentic pain when they heard it. And that new audience brought Cash into contact with artists like Lemmy Kilmister, who had been listening to Cash since he was a teenager in England, absorbing the darkness and rebellion that lived beneath the hymns. Backstage at that festival, the two men sat across from each other in folding chairs, Cash drinking black coffee, Lemmy nursing his eternal Jack Daniels and Coke. Cash talked about his addiction years, about the amphetamines that nearly destroyed his marriage, his career, his life. He talked about finding God in the wreckage. Lemmy listened without interrupting, which was unusual for a man known for his sharp tongue. Something about Cash's story resonated with him, not the God part. Lemmy had no use for religion and made no secret of it. What resonated was the honesty, the willingness to admit weakness, the refusal to sugarcoat the ugliness of addiction. When Cash finished talking, Lemmy took a long sip of his drink, looked Cash in the eye, and said something to the effect that they were the same animal, just with different handlers. Cash laughed at that, a deep rumbling laugh that shook his entire frame, and from that moment on the two men shared a bond that confused everyone around them. But the moment that would truly define their friendship, the moment involving a leather-bound Bible and a glass of whiskey, was still years away, and when it finally arrived, it would reveal something about both men that their public images had always kept carefully hidden. The invitation nobody expected. Cash and Lemmy stayed in touch after that first meeting. Not frequently, because neither man was the type for phone calls, but consistently enough that each one knew what was happening in the other's world. Cash sent Lemmy a handwritten note when Motorhead released Sacrifice in 1995, telling him the album sounded like the apocalypse set to music. Lemmy kept that note folded in his wallet for years. Their friendship operated on a frequency most people could not hear, a mutual understanding between two men who had built their lives on refusing to be anything other than exactly who they were. So when Cash was planning a special concert in the late 90s, one of those events designed to showcase the breadth of his musical relationships, he personally called Lemmy and told him he wanted him there, not just as a spectator but as a performer. Lemmy reportedly hesitated, not because he was nervous about playing. Lemmy could perform in his sleep and often looked like he was doing exactly that. He hesitated because he was not sure his presence would be welcome in Cash's world, a world of hymns and hallelujahs and audiences who probably thought Motorhead was a brand of engine part. But Cash insisted, and when Johnny Cash insisted on something, the universe generally found it easier to just go along rather than argue. The night everything changed. The venue was packed, every seat filled with the kind of audience you would expect at a Johnny Cash event. older couples who had been listening since the Folsom prison days, younger fans who discovered him through American recordings, a handful of journalists who had heard rumors that something unusual was planned. The air had that electric quality it gets when history is about to be made, even though nobody knows what form it will take. Cash opened the way he always did, alone with his guitar, his voice filling the room like black water rising. He played the hits, the songs everyone knew by heart, and the audience sang along and felt that deep comfort of hearing a voice they had known their entire lives. But there was something different about Cash that night, a spark in his eye, a barely contained energy suggesting he was saving his best card for last. Roughly an hour into the set, Cash paused, looked out at the audience with that legendary gaze, and announced he had a special guest, a friend who some of them might find surprising but who he considered one of the most honest men in the music business. The murmur that went through the crowd when Lemmy walked out from the side of the stage was something between confusion and disbelief. Here was this figure from another universe, wearing his trademark bullet belt and denim vest, his mutton chops framing a face that looked like it had been carved from stone by someone who had never heard of symmetry, a glass of Jack Daniels in one hand, and his Rickenbacker slung over his shoulder like a weapon. The contrast was almost comical. Cash in his immaculate black suit, standing with the quiet confidence of a man at peace with his demons. Lemmy, looking like he had just been in a fistfight with his demons and was planning a second round. But something remarkable happened when they began to play together. The music found a common ground nobody would have thought possible. Cash's deep baritone and Lemmy's thunderous bass created something neither country nor metal but entirely new, something raw and primal that went straight to the gut. The crowd that had been confused at first was now on its feet, and nobody could have known that the real moment, the moment people would still be talking about decades later, had not even happened yet. The Bible moment. They played 3 songs together, each one drawing the audience deeper into this impossible collaboration. And then, as the final notes faded, something happened that nobody saw coming. Not the audience, not the crew, not even Lemmy himself. Johnny Cash set down his guitar, reached slowly into the inside pocket of his black coat, and pulled out a small leather-bound Bible. The room went quiet in that breathless way that only happens when every person in a space simultaneously realizes they are witnessing something significant. Cash held the Bible up so the audience could see it, then turned to Lemmy with an expression that was part mischief and part genuine affection. He was offering the book to Lemmy, in front of everyone. The most devout man in country music was giving the word of God to a man who had publicly and repeatedly declared that he did not believe in God, did not want to believe in God, and would rather spend eternity in hell where the music was better and the drinks were stronger. The silence lasted maybe 5 seconds but felt like an hour. Every eye was locked on Lemmy, waiting to see how the frontman of the loudest band in the world would respond to being handed a Bible on stage. Would he refuse it? Would he throw it? Would he make some crude joke that would confirm every terrible assumption? The tension was extraordinary, the kind of moment that separates legends from ordinary performers. Lemmy looked at the Bible in Cash's outstretched hand. He looked at Cash. He looked at the audience. And then, with the kind of comic timing that cannot be rehearsed, the kind that only comes from decades of reading rooms, Lemmy took the Bible, held it up reverently for just a moment, tucked it carefully under his arm, then picked up his glass of Jack Daniels, raised it toward heaven with an absolutely deadpan expression, and drained the entire thing in one long continuous swallow, as if the Bible and the whiskey were 2 halves of the same sacrament. The crowd erupted. But the real story was Johnny Cash, who stood watching this unholy communion and started laughing so hard his knees buckled. The laughter came in waves, each bigger than the last, and every time Cash seemed to get himself under control, he would look at Lemmy standing there with the Bible under one arm and the empty glass in the other, and the laughter would start all over again. No one had ever seen Johnny Cash laugh like this. Completely unguarded, the kind of laughter that strips away every mask and shows the real person underneath. What nobody knew about that laughter. There was a deeper layer to that laughter, one the audience could not have known about. The reason Cash laughed so hard was not simply because Lemmy had done something funny. Cash laughed because Lemmy had done something profoundly honest, and honesty was the currency their entire friendship was built on. Cash had spent decades watching people perform their faith, watching televangelists who talked about God on Sunday and cheated on their wives on Monday. He had seen the hypocrisy of organized religion from the inside, had struggled with it himself during his darkest years when he was popping pills and praising Jesus in the same breath. And here was Lemmy, a man who made absolutely no pretense about who he was, responding to a sacred offering with the most Lemmy gesture imaginable. He did not reject the Bible. He did not disrespect it. He accepted it. And then he paired it with the only other scripture he had ever followed, the holy book of Jack Daniels, and he did it with such perfect sincerity that it became, in its own twisted way, a genuine act of devotion. Lemmy was saying without words that this was his communion, this was his prayer, and if Cash's God had a problem with that, well, Lemmy had been disappointing authority figures his entire life and was not about to stop now. That was why Cash laughed. Not because it was a joke, but because it was the truth. The story that spread like wildfire. The story of that night traveled through the music world like a brushfire, passed from musician to musician, from roadie to roadie, growing slightly with each telling but never losing its essential core. What made it special was not just the comedy, though the comedy was undeniable. It revealed that Cash, for all his solemnity, had a wicked sense of humor and a genuine appreciation for irreverence. And it revealed that Lemmy, for all his leather and loudness, had a kind of grace about him, a way of navigating impossible situations with an instinct closer to elegance than anyone would have expected from the man who wrote Ace of Spades. Cash reportedly told the story to anyone who would listen, to his wife June Carter, who apparently said Lemmy needed Jesus more than any man alive, to his producer, Rubin, who immediately wanted to get the two of them in a studio together, to fellow musicians who could barely believe it even coming from Cash himself. The Bible itself became a kind of artifact in the story. Some say Lemmy kept it, that it sat on the shelf in his small Lowe's Angels apartment alongside his infamous collection of World War II memorabilia, a leather-bound Bible wedged between Nazi daggers and iron crosses, which would have been such a perfectly Lemmy arrangement that it almost has to be true. What connected these two men was not music, although music was the language they used to communicate. What connected them was a shared understanding that authenticity was the only thing worth fighting for. Cash had learned that lesson through addiction and collapse, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding a life from the ashes. Lemmy had learned it differently, not through collapse and recovery, but through sheer stubborn refusal to ever be anything other than exactly who he was. Cash's path led to God. Lemmy's path led to the bottom of a whiskey glass and the thundering low end of a Rickenbacker bass. But both paths were honest, and both men knew it, and that mutual recognition was the foundation of everything between them. In a world full of performers pretending to be something they were not, Cash and Lemmy had found in each other the rarest thing in the entertainment industry, a person who was exactly the same off stage as they were on it. And that discovery was worth more to both of them than any platinum record or sold-out arena. The final chapter. Johnny Cash died on September 12, 2003, just 4 months after losing June Carter, the woman who had pulled him back from the edge and given him a reason to believe that damaged people could still be loved. The news sent shockwaves through every corner of the music world, but it hit certain people harder than others. Lemmy, on tour with Motorhead when the news reached him, is said to have gone very quiet for a long time, which anyone who knew him understood was far more significant than any outward display of grief. Lemmy was not a man who cried publicly or delivered emotional speeches. He processed loss the way he processed everything else, internally, behind those dark eyes and beneath those legendary mutton chops. For a few shows after Cash's death, Lemmy played with even more ferocity than usual, attacking his Rickenbacker like he was trying to beat something out of it. And those paying attention understood that this was his eulogy, delivered not in words but in volume and fury, and the relentless forward momentum of music played at the absolute limit of human endurance. There had been talk about a proper collaboration, a studio recording to capture the impossible chemistry between them. Rubin had been trying to make it happen, but time is the one enemy that even legends cannot defeat, and the recording never materialized. It remains one of the great lost possibilities of music history, filed alongside all the other collaborations that should have existed but never did. Lemmy Kilmister died on December 28, 2015, 4 days after his 70th birthday. The cancer that killed him had only been diagnosed 2 days before. In his small apartment in Los Angeles, among the war memorabilia and the empty bottles and the bass guitars that had shaken stadiums around the world, there were traces of a life lived entirely on its own terms. And somewhere in that apartment, according to those who were there in the final days, there was a small leather-bound Bible, worn at the edges, tucked between objects that no Bible had any business being near, a permanent reminder of a night when two legends stood on a stage and proved that honesty, in whatever form it takes, is the only thing that truly matters.